Hello. My guest today is Dr. Prakash Shah. He is reader of culture and law at Queen Mary University of London. Prakash Shah spent his most of his academic life and most of his working life tracking how culture has panned out in the UK, especially Hindu culture in recent years. He's an expert on many things, including caste in Hinduism. Prakash Shah, thanks very much for your time.
Nice to be here.
Prakash, I want to talk to you today about one particular thing. The first ever Hindu Manifesto released in the UK. Now, in the UK, we have seen a lot of turmoil happening between Hindus and Muslims, may I say, and also rise of Islamist, radicalism in a wider society, but also clashes between Hindus and Muslims, like we saw in Leicester. Following all of this, for the first time, the Hindu groups seem to have come together and put together a manifesto for politicians saying that the same privileges, in a sense, that is accorded to Islam and other communities, other faith-based communities, should be accorded to Hinduism too, including, identifying and recognizing acts of violence or prejudice against Hindus as such, that it's an act against a Hindu rather than one more statistic. All of this is there in that Hindu manifesto. I want to talk to you about this. This will obviously have an impact in the upcoming elections in the UK, which is going to happen in a few months. And also, not a few months, a few weeks, right? Also, this will have an impact on broader organizational strength of the Hindu community. Prakash, why has this happened according to you? Why now? Why have the groups come together at this juncture, and what are they hoping to achieve?
The why question is not entirely clear, but it seems to be that a number of prominent Hindu organizations on the British landscape have all come together, and they've identified a set of, let's say, common concerns or concerns of mutually agreed importance, and they've decided to make sure that these are articulated as political demands. And of course, that's quite important, as you rightly said, because of the impending general election, which is on the 4th of July. Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit also about, in this particular moment, the fact that these groups have come together to bring out a Hindu manifesto. What does it say to us about how the Hindu community in the UK is feeling?
At one level, you might say that this is, you rightly say that this is unprecedented. I think it is too. And you might say that this is the most coherently formulated set of political demands by a seemingly united Hindu group, right? Or a group of Hindu organizations which have actually come together and said, look, these are concerns of ours in common. And so, in that sense, it signals a moment of political importance and importance of for the let's say the life and continued viability of the Hindu communities in Britain. I suppose at a different level of abstraction, you might say that it also signals a sort of political maturation of the Hindu community. You see, the Hindu community so far has been it's been present in the UK for a long time in substantial numbers, as you will know, no doubt. But you might say that they've been relatively politically acquiescent, particularly, as you said, with respect to, if you by comparison with Muslim communities or even the Sikh community, the Hindus have tended to be more politically acquiescent. And so here you see a kind of maturation which I suppose is of historical importance in that sense, but also because of the effort to put together a kind of more or less coherent set of demands. I don't think that they're entirely coherent, as I've tried to explain in my written criticism, which got published this week. But it is nevertheless an event of some importance.
As you said, this has never happened before, and this is correct, not just in the UK, but also in the US and other parts of the world. Within the Indian diaspora, the Hindu community has never been very politically active. It's been very active in business. It's been very active in academia. It's even being active in other kinds of things, including culture and sports, but not politics. The rise, especially in the UK, of a particular kind of, Islamist political activity and also Sikh political activity on the Khalistan issue seems to have put the Hindu community, in a sense, it has triggered new ideas and thoughts about the way forward within the Hindu community. I mentioned the Leicester riots, but also, the attacks on the Indian High Commission by Khalistani groups. Obviously, the Hindu community is seeing all of this happening and, in a sense, responding to some of these things. Talk to us a little bit about the turmoils and anxieties the Hindu community may have dealt with in the past few years. The Khalistan incident, Leicester, when I used to live in England, attacks on the Indian embassy, a whole range of things.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. Actually, this let's say initiative doesn't come out of nowhere. But at the same time, I would like to say that there are multiple set of factors which, let's say, result in this kind of congealing of a set of political demands. But I think you're absolutely right to say that there have been attacks, let's say, from the outside towards Hindus and Indians living in Britain. And that's certainly part of the reason which leads to this sort of congealment of set of political demands. So we have, in fact, if you go back to the withdrawal of Article 370 in India with respect to Kashmir, soon after that you saw attacks on the Indian High Commission, which were, pretty unpleasant, and we felt that the Indian High Commission itself was not well protected by the police in London, and there may be particular reasons for that, and particular sort of, let's say, acquiescence by the political authorities because of that. But the attacks have actually continued since 2019. Right? Of course, it wasn't the first time that such attacks happened, but it wasn't also the last time. Unfortunately, the manifesto is somewhat let's say, ambiguous about the type of attacks that have happened. It refers to the attack in the singular, but I think there have been more than one such attacks which have been very badly policed, and the premises of the Indian High Commission were attacked, but also people who were, in fact, once there was a Diwali celebration outside High Commission, and actually, ordinary individuals, elderly, women, children were attacked with, bottles of water and God knows what other kinds of objects. So that's one set of events. The other big event, of course, has been the Leicester, let's say, unrest in September 2022. That also doesn't come out of nothing, right? Because what happened was that a set of Hindu youth in particular decided to walk through the streets of that city. And the trigger for that, let's say, demonstration, a kind of exercise of civil rights by walking through the streets by the youth, was a whole set of other incidents where you found that either there were direct attacks on Hindu homes and families or individuals, or there were rumors that Hindus were attacking Muslims. And all of those rumors happened to be falsely placed into social media and so on, right? So actually, basically, they were a form of blood libel, right? Because let's say, as soon as you have an allegation that, some Hindu has, desecrated the Quran, that's a kind of, red rag to a bull situation where any Hindu could be attacked, right? And particularly those Hindus who might be identifiable or have become falsely identified with that particular incident would be easily prone to violent forms of attacks, right? So there's been this combination of a set of occurrences which, by which Hindus have been attacked from the outside, by Muslims, by, Khalistanis and so on. And this has certainly played its own role in concretizing a kind of political consciousness. But there's also been this sort of drip feeling over a period of decades that Hindus are underserved. right? You rightly observed that, in many ways, Hindus are a very successful population. The manifesto itself observes that Hindus contribute out of proportion to their composition in the population as a whole. And at the same time, there is this constant feeling that we're being underserved, right? So when it comes to, let's say, protection of mandirs and temples, the services that Hindus can expect from the fostering agencies or social services in general, all those kinds of things, you'll actually see that Hindus they're not only underserved, but they also underclaim to the benefits that they're entitled. And so this manifesto is also an expression of a set of demands to the politicians, those who are standing for parliament, to sign up to, and who should commit that the Hindus will be, let's say, at least equitably or equally served, right, by all the provisions that the state makes to support communities, to protect communities, and so on. Right? So you actually overall you see a huge set of demands. So there are these demands for, let's say, equal protection under the social care laws. Then there are demands about anti-Hindu hate and Hinduphobia, and then there are also demands for the proscribing of certain groups which haven't yet been proscribed under the anti-terror laws in Britain, right? And examples would include the LET, the International Sikh Youth Federations, Sikhs for Justice, and the JKLF. Organization. So there's actually a very specifically articulated demand that these organizations should be proscribed under the available anti-terror laws. And for some reason, they haven't been, right? Which is actually also, I suppose, adds to the grievance of the Indian community here and the Hindus in particular. That you are going around proscribing all kinds of other terror organizations, but these guys seem to have a free hand in operating and causing mischief, attacking the High Commission, and so on. And why does that happen?
Prakash, the other thing that's probably happening, and I want your comments on this, is that for the first time you mentioned attacks on temples. Now we of course saw those during the Leicester conflict. We also saw that later on well-published research documents from the government that came out saying that a lot of the allegations about the Hindu community were turned out to be wrong. There were all kinds of things that were said, all of which in the research documents from the government, those documents said that all those allegations were wrong, and yet a huge hullabaloo were made about it. I remember this character called Muhammad Hijab, for instance, one of the most notorious and virulent characters leading this kind of very violent kind of a language and protest. In a sense, the Hindu community seems to be finally, in a sense, on its guard. And even temples, I saw with interest that one of the supporters of this Hindu Manifesto is BAPS. And, BAPS is an organization we all know really never puts itself out there in any sort of even quasi political matters. It really has traditionally always over all these years kept itself very confined to a spiritual domain. But BAPS putting its hand out in a sense to lend support to a manifesto really suggests that something deep has stirred within the Hindu consciousness, collective consciousness within the UK. Talk to us a little bit about that, because unlike many religious institutions of other communities, Hindu temples largely never took a political stand. But this seems to be this has broken that norm, and that seems to be very interesting. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think you're right. If you look at the likes of BAPS, the ISKCON organization, it is true to say that historically you might be forgiven for saying or thinking that they've taken a fairly apolitical or politically acquiescent position on many matters of importance to Hindus. The one I remember most clearly is the way in which they prevaricated on the issue of the caste legislation. Which has been sort of, an ongoing issue for longer than 10 years now in the UK context. And to get a simple declaration from these organizations that, the caste legislation is really going to be used to harm Hindus, not really to protect those who are allegedly being discriminated against. it was very difficult, actually. It was impossible. And we never received a formal plea to the government from these organizations to say, at the very least, what you should do is, abolish this legislation or renege on it. It hasn't been fully implemented, but, nevertheless, it should be simply removed from the statute book altogether. So yes, I think in a way you're right. Maybe it is the fact that particular temples were being attacked in the context of the Leicester situation, where there's one of the mandirs is called the Shivalai Mandir, and that was, people were actually climbing onto the spire and trying to remove the flag and so on. And at the same time, you get this sort of blood libel being spread to the police by the Muslim agitators, where they would say, "Oh, this is a symbol of hate. This is a symbol of Hindutva," and so on. Right? Similarly, in the same set of events that unfolded in September, in Birmingham, there was also an attack on a Hindu temple. Right, so you got a kind of concentrated set of events during that particular September, events, and it may well be that this was also a kind of trigger for the Hindus to say, now this is enough. Right. We also know that recently Jews were promised particular protection and financial, with financial backing for synagogues. And of course, we know that the Jewish community is in a particular situation, and they are quite vulnerable to attacks by Islamists and, the leftist organizations and so on. And there have been a continuous set of marches, almost every weekend since the events of October 7th. And so that's obviously put a lot of pressure on the Jewish community. And a lot of concern has been expressed about the sanctity of their place of worship, the kind of the integrity of their, individual, let's say, persons, bodies, properties, and so on. So yeah, fair enough that the Jews were granted specific financial backing for protecting the synagogues and so on. But you see, when Hindus view these kinds of events, they realize that, well, there are particular moves being made by the government. Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, actually met a delegation of Jewish community representatives and made sure that they were listened to, that money was made forthcoming and so on. But no such moves have ever been made for Hindus. Right. Although, as you rightly say, there have been report after report which says that either Hindus have been underserved or they face particular vulnerabilities, and there are a lot of reports of attacks on Hindu temples, not just the two that I mentioned. Over the decades, there've been continuous set of vulnerabilities experienced by Hindu temples. Now, of course, one argument which was put to me by a representative of one of the Hindu organizations privately was that Hindus are also notoriously bad at applying for funding that is available, right? So some of what you see in the manifesto can plausibly be put down to simply, a level of incompetence by the representatives of different Hindu organizations in claiming what is rightfully theirs, right? So some of it might well be about that, right? Let's say, I don't know, some of the other demands are about, the teaching of Hinduism, or making sure that Indic languages are taught widely and so on. A lot of that is not just going to happen automatically, right? You have to have the syllabi in place. You have to have a plausible kind of, way of teaching and so on. It is true that Christianity and Islam dominate the religious studies curricula in Britain, as maybe they do in other Western countries as well. But, and it is true that Hinduism is actually taught in very few schools across the country. But then you can ask the question, well, whose responsibility is it? Is it for Hindus to simply step up and say, look, this is the way we should approach the teaching of Hinduism. This is how we should ask for representation in the locally constituted committees which devise RE syllabuses and so on. And so there's a combination of being underserved, being discriminated against, being attacked, and also a sense of apathy as well. Which is in a way the default characteristic of the Hindu community in Britain. And that's why, as you rightly observed, the formulation of this particular manifesto is of particular momentous kind of significance.
Prakash, that's very interesting. The other thing that occurs to me when I hear you speak and when I read the manifesto is that for a whole, or not just one, maybe many generations of Hindus in the UK and also in the US, their real focus was, in a sense, academic and financial success. You needed to make enough money to make ends meet. You needed to send your children to good schools, good colleges, ensure that they have a future. And quite like just, the Hindu children are told in India, like my parents told me, politics is not meant for people like us. It's a bad thing. Bad people do bad things there. Ordinary people like us need to really take care of our house, make money, send our children again to good schools and colleges, advance in our careers, so to speak. But
Mm.
today, perhaps many organizations and community groups are realizing that's not enough. In America, for instance, the Hindus are the most well adjusted, wealthiest, and most educated minority. And yet, that's not enough. Khalistanis are attacking and setting a fire, as it happened in the US, to Indian councils, right?
Yeah.
And officers in the West Coast. We saw this in America. The Indian embassy at the heart of London is being attacked by Khalistanis again and again. So the
Yes.
fact that some of the wealthiest people in the UK are Hindu, the fact that Hindus operate in every major organization or sector of the economy at very
Mm.
high levels, entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, so on and so forth, all of this doesn't matter unless you have a certain political say. And I like
Mm.
the point that you made, and perhaps you could elaborate on that, Prakash, on how there has been a reticence, if I may use this word, to
Yeah.
claim and demand that, look, because we are part of the community, this is owed to us as British citizens, tax paying, law abiding British citizens, constantly, constructively, putting in our best into the community. Why do you think this reticence existed in the first place? And do you really feel that this is the beginning of the breaking, in a sense, of that reticence?
Yes. Actually, I'm quite ambivalent about it. Although the symbolically, the production of this manifesto might be seen as of kind of significant moment. I'm not really sure if we're going to see a follow through. And I say that for a number of reasons. Partly because of knowing about the default position of the Hindus in Britain. And to me, it raises a number of interesting questions, which are also, from an intellectual perspective, quite relevant as well. Is it possible to say that, let's say, the default Indian traditional way of doing politics is different to how politics in the West occurs? And is it unfair to say of Hindus that they don't do politics? Or is it, on the other hand, is it fairer to say that Hindus may do politics, but they do a politics of a particular kind which doesn't get the register in Western political, let's say, formations? Right, and I think that there's something to that. I mean, I don't have a firm hypothesis at the moment, but I think there's definitely something like that going on, and I'm pretty sure that in a larger context like India, you would see something similar going on as well, right? You said yourself, there's almost a discouragement of the youth to enter into politics and that sort of thing. It's regarded as a kind of not a very respectable profession, and that sort of thing. So better to ensure that you have a stable economic foundation and moral foundation and so on, but don't go into this dirty business of politics. So there may be something there which holds Hindus back from mirroring a kind of Western political style or idiom, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, and it may be linked to this as well, is the low numbers in which Hindus turn out to vote, and this is something you see similar patterns in India going on as well, right? And again, you could ask the question, is this political apathy, or is this just acknowledging that the way of Hindus doing politics is different? It's not by electoral representation. Like, they have maybe a more sophisticated way of doing politics. Who knows, right? But it's just that it doesn't register with us as intellectual or academics, because we also haven't developed the right sort of tools to be able to measure this. On the other hand, right? So that's all that stuff on the plus side. On the negative side, I would say that the experience that we do have and the observations that we've made show us that whenever Hindus are, let's say, encountering political authorities or individual politicians and so on, they will not make any articulate political demands, right? And what they will ask for maybe is to ensure that their own business interests are taken care of. That, let's say, if they're like a member of an NGO or Hindu Samaj organizations or something like that, they will ensure that they get what they regard as their fair share of funding or grants, right? That sort of thing. But there isn't this sort of wider corporate political awareness that you might perhaps be forgiven for thinking the Hindu Manifesto actually manifests, right? So if that's the case, then should we say that there is really a lack of political consciousness here, right? There isn't any kind of coherent thinking about politics among Hindus at large. And if that's the case, then we have a big problem, right? I would like to add a fourth dimension to this, though. When you look at the way in which politics is, let's say, panning out in the Western context, particularly with respect to the ways in which different communities do politics, it seems to me that there is a kind of splitting according to a Western idiom of identity politics. So you see the Muslims being very articulate, very strategic in terms of which constituencies they're going to target. And, they might even be quite, let's say, polyamorous in terms of, not being attached to one political party, but go to any political party or candidate which is going to deliver the results for them, which they think are necessary, such as the recognition of Palestine or whatever. So that's on the Muslim side. On the Sikh side, in fact, there's been this week a new Sikh manifesto, which is not for the first time that that's been produced. It's got a pretty Khalistani orientation, which perhaps doesn't surprise you. And in that, Hindu nationalism and the specter of, the sort of Hindutva features writ large, actually, right? So this is, if you like, the Khalistani, or let's say some kind of Sikh way of articulating its own political vision. And so you see the Hindus kind of uncomfortably trying to fit into this idiom of identity politics, right? Which I think doesn't also come naturally to them. I don't think the Hindu way of doing politics is an identity politics, right? So for me as a Hindu to conceive of myself as though I should be representing the interests of the Hindu community at large, whatever that is, what is the interest of the Hindu community at the end of the day? And so here you have some kind of ill-fittingness again, right? Which goes back to the first 2 points I raised. About the way in which politics is done in the West and how Hindus always feel a certain level of discomfort and unease in fitting into that paradigm. So there's a lot of questions for us as Hindus to figure out, right? What are we doing? In what context are we doing it? What is the dominant idiom in which we are being forced to do it? And one of the greatest manifestations of that is the latching on to this issue of Hinduphobia, right? Again, it's an imitative form of politics because the Muslims have their Islamophobia. It's seen as being a very successful way of claims making for Muslims. Whenever you utter the label or the term Islamophobia, everybody else has to shut up and give in to your demands. So Hindus are trying to mirror that. And that's also, you mentioned the United States, that's also something that kind of is being increasingly influenced by the way in which the American Hindus are developing their own politics over there. And in fact, I think, despite the prevalence of the vocabulary of anti-Hindu hate, the label Hinduphobia has been retained. And if you look at the instances of Hinduphobia which the manifesto spells out, actually they're more or less a carbon copy of the American original, right? So there again, I don't see a lot of original thinking or serious reflection on what we as Hindus should be doing, but it's a kind of imitative politics. Right. Now, going deeper into the anti-Hindu hate stroke Hinduphobia thing, some of the instances which the manifesto identifies as being instances of anti-Hindu hate, such as the identification of Hindus with India, right? There's a kind of undercurrent that such identification is unfair, but you see, you could ask the question: is that really hate? Right? What's hateful about that? It might be incorrect, right? But on the other hand, Hindus also want to, many Hindus also want to identify with India. If you look at the manifesto, maybe the word India is mentioned at least 10 times in the manifesto. So it's not just the Hindu manifesto. It's, there are constant recurrences of the link with India anywhere, right? So if you look at it from that point of view, perhaps the Hindu manifesto is also a symbol of anti-Hindu hate because it associates Hindus with India. So there's, these kinds of internal contradictions there, which make it very difficult to endorse the document as a whole, right? And my particular criticism is that, yes, the Hindu organizations have taken a lead on this, but what they haven't done is consulted the experts. And they haven't brought in the expertise, which is actually, we have a lot of expertise in the Hindu community, to pay attention to different sections of the manifesto and make sure that the inconsistencies are ironed out, there's some kind of coherence to it, and that the demands are realistic, right, and plausible. And so there's a lot of work that could have been done, which hasn't been done. I don't know if the Hindu Manifesto was brought out in a rush because of the impending election, which also, as you know, was called out, at very short notice. So that may have something to do with it. But at some levels, I find it to be quite a disappointing document.
Tell me, Prakash, in conclusion, as we wrap up this conversation, which has been very, very interesting, what would you have seen more as far as inputs go into such a manifesto? And this takes off from your, the points of criticism that you just mentioned. What more could have been put in? What more indeed can be put in for future such manifestos?
Yeah, great question, because it allows me to talk about my favorite topic, which is that of caste. And I mentioned the caste legislation already. Now, in the Equality Act of 2010 was a mention of caste as, if you like, tantamount to a form of, to being a form of racial discrimination. So far, that provision has not been implemented. Right? And in fact, there was a consultation which ended in 2018 in which the government promised to repeal that particular clause. Now, a group of us have been trying to make representations to the British government, to the Rishi Sunak government, to get them to live up to their promise and make sure that mention of caste is deleted. Now, there's no prospect of that happening, right? So it's predicted that the Labour Party will come in with a very significant majority, and it's almost certain that the Labour Party will implement it, given their past performance on the caste issue, caste debates, and so on, right? Now, one of my biggest criticisms about the manifesto is that it's a missed opportunity to really talk about and insist upon the repeal of the clause relating to caste inequality. Right. Now, I was told by somebody who is maybe quite close to the drafting process of the manifesto, and he said to me, we didn't really want to raise controversial issues in the manifesto, right? We wanted prospective parliamentary candidates to be able to sign up to the manifesto without thinking too much about it, or without, it creating a kind of reluctance among them. Having said that, the manifesto has other controversial topics. When you're asking for the prescription of certain organizations, that's not an apolitical let's say, statement, right? When you're delving into the immigration issue, which the manifesto does, which is actually a very contentious issue in Britain, that's also a controversial, potential point of controversy. So there's no plausible reason why the caste issue couldn't have been raised, right? Now, what will happen is that the Labour Party will implement that provision, will never be able to get rid of it. And it will be used as a stick in Britain through the legal system to abuse Hindus, right? And, some of the American reports already show that, and actually reports in Britain as well, show that young Hindu children in schools are abused on caste grounds, right? And this is not Hindus discriminating against, low caste people and so on. They're being abused on caste grounds because they're Hindu. Right, as though they are, the archetypal, let's say, kind of manifestation or personification of evil. So, given that, having a law on caste discrimination is just going to exacerbate existing patterns. And as I said, I don't think Hindus are going to have a seriously realistic prospect of convincing any political party to get rid of this in future once it gets implemented. So that's one of the biggest criticisms I have of the manifesto. And it's a big missed opportunity, unfortunately.
This was a fascinating conversation, Prakash. The way you paint it and the subjects you brought up are really, really important. I hope the right people listen. And I agree with you that any caste legislation is essentially, in America, for instance, I have a firm belief that essentially this is to attack Indian power in Silicon Valley. It has nothing to do with social justice. In America, the caste issue is only solely there to hit out at Indian power in Silicon Valley so that the big tech companies become more wary of hiring Hindus. In Britain, again, I think this is again, essentially targeted towards the very successful Hindu communities in many, many sectors. Banking in the city of London, for instance, full of extremely well accomplished, very sharp financial minds from the Hindu community. Again, a potential target in academia. Already, we are seeing in your community and others. So I completely agree with you. Having said that, final words, Prakash. This, of course, as you rightly say, is indeed a big red flag. But having said that, do you at least think that because the communities have at least been able to come together and produce one document that at least the major sort of players in the community agree on, and very critically, the temples have lent support for the first time. In a sense, it's a breakthrough of some sort.
Um, I think we'll have to see in due course how important this kind of document is going to be. Last time I checked, which was yesterday, we only had 4 prospective parliamentary candidates out of more than, literally hundreds, thousands of parliamentary candidates signing up to this document. So, in terms of the kind of outreach and making sure that, prospective parliamentary candidates are on board, I don't think we're there yet, And how many weeks do we have to the election? Not many, about maybe 2-3 weeks maximally. So that's not a very encouraging sign. The other issue, which I have mentioned in my criticism in writing, is follow through. See, I also mentioned that with respect to caste and the legislation there hadn't been followed through by any Hindu organization to make sure that the government lives up to its promise. And we had something like more than 5 years for them to do that, right? And these were organizations who had backed the consultation result back in the day. Is the same thing going to happen with the Hindu Manifesto, right? Is there going to be a lack of follow-up to say, okay, well, you signed up to making sure Hindus get an equitable say in fostering services or social services or protection for temples, etc., etc. Have you delivered? Is there going to be that kind of accountability at the end of the day? Or is it going to be the usual suspect set of MPs who are always supportive of the Hindu community, which is not a big group of them, who will say yes to almost everything the Hindus ask for, but the broader political community and political establishment just remains oblivious to the reality of Hindu life in Britain. So I'm skeptical, and I'm happy to be proved wrong, but let's see what will happen in due course.
Dr. Prakash Shah, we'll have to leave it at that. Thanks very much for your very insightful comments on the first ever Hindu Manifesto for a British election that has ever been produced, supported by major Hindu organizations. Could it be a new beginning in political awareness among the Hindus? Is it also a missed opportunity as far as caste is concerned? Many things to discuss, and I'm sure we will be catching up on these issues again soon. Prakash Shah, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Inder.